Good afternoon, Year 10s. Nice to see you all. I hope you're safe and well. In today's video tutorial, we are looking at Macbeth Act 4, Scene 2. Just to remind you where we left off last lesson, we looked at Act 4, Scene 1 and the apparition scene where Macbeth drinks the concoction that the witches have been making, and he receives a hallucination or a vision of these four different apparitions: the child, the bloody child, the child with a tree in its hand, um, the armed head, and the line of kings, and they all have a very symbolic meaning. We looked at the symbolic meaning of and Macbeth's reaction to each apparition, and we talked about how this is the moment of ananorisis, the moment of realization when the tragic hero goes from ignorance to knowledge. And by that, to be really clear, it's when Macbeth goes from being ignorant about the fact that the witches are merely toying with him to knowledgeable about the fact that he's a pawn in a sense. So in today's lesson, we're looking at Act 4, Scene 2, and I'll show you a summary of that scene now. Okay, the summary is up now on your screen, so I'll give you 30 seconds or so to have a read, so you won't hear my voice for a little while. So on your board, you have a kind of artistic interpretation of this scene, and I'm just going to briefly explain to you the significance of the scene and relate it to some of the key themes that have kind of come up and recurred throughout the play. It's a very, and I'll talk about the dramatic significance as well. It comes literally moments after Macbeth's aside, in which he declares, "From now on, the first things of my heart should be the first things of my hand." So what he meant by that is that from now on, whenever he has a murderous impulse, he will act upon it. So he's essentially committing himself to becoming a violent and despotic and oppressive tyrant. He's going to crush any dissent, anyone standing in his way, anyone he even so much as fears might be an obstacle. He will destroy them and annihilate them. So he's committing himself to being a bloodthirsty tyrant. And this scene comes straight off of that, straight off the back of that. It takes place in Macduff's own castle. We know already that Macduff has fled, so which makes the crime that Macbeth is committing here almost even more callous and heinous. We also talked about his. We talked about in last lesson his in his aside. Macbeth speaks about surprising the castle of Macduff, giving to the edge of the sword his wife, his babes, all that follow in his line. So essentially, Macbeth's plan here in sending murderers to Macduff's castle is to very much eradicate the Macduff clan, Macduff's lineage, to destroy any family that he has, so that he cannot pass on his title of the Thane of Fife to his sons. So it's essentially eradicating his entire family tree. So it's an incredibly brutal act. Um, so that's the kind of significance of it to a certain extent. It's also a significant act in relation to the character of scene. Sorry, in relation to the character of Macduff, because we know that Macduff has, for unknown reasons, fled to England. Well, we know the reasons roughly. He wants to encourage Malcolm, who's in exile there, to return and to battle Macbeth and take back the throne. But it does seem like a strange and grievous error to have left his wife and family behind him. So this scene serves as a really powerful symbol, I would argue, of Macbeth's tyranny. The fact that he chooses to, murder innocents who have nothing to do with, who are related to Macduff rather, and have done nothing wrong, is strikingly powerful and shocking. It's a very evocative scene for the audience. The final scene in this scene, as it were, is Lady Macduff running away from the murderers, having already seen her young son murdered in front of her eyes. It's an incredibly heart-wrenching scene that obviously creates a lot of pathos for the character of Lady Macduff and her son. But I would say most importantly, it's another example from Shakespeare to reiterate the theme of tyranny and oppression, and to once again emphasize Macbeth's demise. If you think about how Macbeth has been how Macbeth has been characterized throughout the play and his development throughout the play, and we go back to Act 1, Scene 2 and the initial descriptions of him as a brave warrior, as a noble and loyal subject, think about how far how far he's descended since that moment, how corrupted he's become, how far he's fallen from grace. I think this is a very significant scene in that regard. We also know that in terms of the structure of the play, we're in Act 4, Scene 2. There's only 3 scenes in Act 4, and then we have the climax and the resolution of the play in Act 5. So we're towards the end of the play, and we're towards that tragic downfall where our tragic hero will be ultimately killed. It's very significant that there's, and I hope this is a fairly obvious point here, Macbeth's killing, the killing of Macbeth is entirely justified because he is a usurper. He's usurped the throne from Duncan. He's committed regicide, but B, he's become an unmerciful king and a tyrant. So his murder at the end of the play by well, not murder, his death, his killing by Macduff at the end of the play is entirely justified in a sense as well. So that's the kind of outline for the scene, and we'll read it through. It's not a very long scene, and then we'll go through some of the key moments in this scene. Okay, so I'm gonna read through the scene. So it's Act 4, Scene 2, and then we'll go through the key moments in the scene. Like I said, as always, I would recommend watching the scene first, or having a read of the scene first before, and then coming back to this in a sense. I think it'll be more useful. So Act 4, Scene 2, Fife, Macduff's castle. Enter Lady Macduff, her son, and Ross. What had he done to make him fly the land? You must have patience, madam. He had none. His flight was madness. When our actions do not, our fears do make us traitors. You know not whether it was his wisdom or his fear. Wisdom? To leave his wife, to leave his babes, to leave his mansion and his titles, in a place from whence himself does fly? He loves us not. He wants the natural touch. For the poor wren, the most diminutive of birds, will fight her young ones in her nest against the owl. All is fear, and nothing is the love. As little as the wisdom where the flights so often against all reason. My dearest coz, I pray you, school yourself. But for your husband he is noble, wise, judicious, and best knows the fits of the season. I dare not speak much further, but cruel are the times when we are traitors and do not know ourselves, when we hold rumour from what we fear, yet know not what we fear, but float upon a wild and violent sea, each way and move. I take my leave of you. Shall not be long, but I'll leave here again. Things at the worst will cease or else climb upward to what they were before. My pretty cousin, blessing upon you. Fathered he is, and yet he's fatherless. I am so much a fool, should I stay longer? It would be my disgrace and yet my discomfort. I would take my leave at once. Okay, so I'm going to read up until then, we'll pause there. So we've read up until Ross's line of take my leave at once. So initially, let's go over the interesting aspects of this scene so far. Okay, so let's consider the most important aspects here. What I think is most interesting initially in this scene is actually kind of a bit more subtle, perhaps, than what it first appears. I think what's interesting initially is the idea that another of Macbeth's noblemen, this time it's Ross, seeming to be questioning Macbeth's fitness for office, and seemingly is kind of subtly working to undermine Macbeth. That's the first thing I think is quite interesting. The second thing I think is interesting is the emotional response of Lady Macduff to the news that her husband has left for England, and she describes it as flight, and it's referred to a lot. This idea that he's fled, that he's flown away, that he's a deserter, and the implication is that he's a coward here. So she's enraged and bewildered. She describes his flight as madness. How could he desert his family? How could he fly away from them? And you'll notice throughout this scene, there is a lot of bird imagery, which links to this idea of Macduff deserting his family, of abandoning his nest, metaphorically speaking. And she accuses him very clearly of fears and betrayal. She says, our fears do make us traitors. So her reaction is clearly one of anger. She's irate, she feels betrayed, she feels as if she's unprotected. She, in a sense, is the female bird in the nest left to raise and defend its young. So that's, I think, quite interesting, and like I said before, it recurs throughout the scene. This idea of the bird imagery, the idea of Macduff abandoning his family, which I think as an audience we would also understand, we'd empathise with, we'd feel pathos for Lady Macduff. It does seem a very irrational move by Macduff, perhaps naive. I'm sure he is intending to return, but it seems naive given how bloodthirsty Macbeth is to have deserted his family and left them behind as he went to England to rally the troops. Ross tries to calm her and says, you don't know whether it was his wisdom or his fear. And then Lady Macduff, for some reason it says in my copy Lady Macbeth, but it should be Lady Macduff. Lady Macduff then kind of ridicules this idea that her husband has been wise. She's very sarcastic. Wisdom! Exclamation mark. To leave his wife, his babes, his mansion, his titles in a place from whence himself does fly. So she's mocking her husband's and his cowardice. Essentially, she's accusing him of being irrational, of being thoughtless, of being rash. And then she uses this metaphor, which kind of explains to the audience and to us her feelings about this desertion. And I'll show you an image to kind of explain what I mean by that. So on your screen you have an image of a wren, which is a small, as you can see, quite a small bird that's native to Scotland and to England. And it's obviously another example of Shakespeare's use of bird imagery throughout the scene. And I won't have my text on the board, so make sure you're jotting this down as we go through. Lady Macduff asks Ross rhetorically, it's a rhetorical question. She says, how could he leave his mansions, his titles, in a place from whence he himself does fly, like the bird leaving its nest? She goes on to say, he loves us not, he wants the natural touch. What she means by he wants the natural touch, I think, is a really fascinating metaphor. What she means by that, I would argue, my interpretation would be that she's referring to the idea that Macduff has acted against natural instincts, and his flight and his desertion of his family is another example of disorder in Scotland. You would expect in a world of natural order for the male bird, metaphorically, to defend its nest and to defend its partner and its young. And what she means here is that Macduff has abandoned his duties in this sense. So I think this is very interesting for that reason. It's also interesting if you consider the character of Macduff as being the avenger. He will come back in Act 5. He will learn of his family's murder. He will come back. He will avenge their murder. He will, like I've said multiple times throughout this series, he will hold aloft the severed head of Macbeth. He will be the avenger. Okay, so it's interesting in terms of, even though he is the avenger, even though he's the hero at the end who restores to a certain extent the equilibrium of life in Scotland, it restores the balance to Scotland, restores the order, in a sense, even Macduff has clearly got flaws, and his flaw here is short-sightedness. His flaw is arguably naivety. I don't think he's being a coward. I think he's being short-sighted. I think with hindsight he would not have left his family behind. But anyway, she says, this is against natural order. She then says, and this is the key line, she says, the poor wren, the most diminutive of birds, will fight her young ones in her nest against the owl. And that metaphor, she herself she's not referring to herself as the wren, although she kind of is by implication. What she means here is she's comparing her husband Macduff to this wren on your screens, and saying that even the smallest bird, even the most vulnerable bird, such as a wren, as you can see, it's a tiny bird, even that bird, that tiny defenseless bird, will fight if an owl tries to hunt or tries to attack its family. And she's saying, and essentially that metaphor is an accusation of cowardice against her husband. She's accusing him of being a coward, of being unnatural, of being a bad father and a neglectful husband. That's what she means by that metaphor. She then reiterates her point. She says, all is the fear, none is the love. Little wisdom and flight goes against all reason. So what she's accusing him of, to be really clear, is acting in a way that's irrational, acting in a way that is cowardly, acting in a way that is unnatural. Okay? Ross tries to calm her down. We'll go back to the text now. Okay, so we've heard this very emotive, very accusatory speech from Lady Macduff about her husband and his neglect of his family and herself. Ross tries to defend Macduff. He says, Macduff is noble, wise, and judicious. So these are all positive adjectives. He's noble, he's wise, and he shows good judgment normally, although clearly this time he hasn't. He best knows the fits of the season, so he knows his own mind. He knows what he's doing. There's then this sense of fear, and Ross says, "I dare not speak much further," and then he goes on to describe in a couple of adjectives, not adjectives, sorry, a couple of metaphors. He describes the state of Scotland under Macbeth, and this becomes, as I've said in a previous lesson, the state of Scotland under Macbeth, the state of tyranny, of oppression, of fear and suffering in Scotland. It becomes a major motif and a major theme as the play develops, and as Macbeth, tries to consolidate his power. But the first kind of metaphor is this idea that he says, cruel are the times when we are traitors and do not know ourselves. What he means by this is because of the cruelty of Macbeth's tyranny, all Scottish people are traitors to themselves. They betray themselves because they have to be obedient to this tyrant. That's what I think he means. He means that we betray ourselves because we have to act stealthily. We have to meet in secret. We have to revolt in secret. That's what I think he means by this. And we do not know ourselves. So there's a sense of the whole nation of Scotland is under this sense of a personality disorder, in a sense. It's lost its sense of self. It's lost its national identity. So I think that's the kind of theme that emerges, this idea of national identity and national pride. That is even more important as a theme in the next scene, I think. So we've got these metaphors, as I said, that link to the theme of tyranny. The next one is this idea, he says, we float upon a wild and violent sea, each way and move. And obviously the comparison here is between Scotland and the oceans, and the raging oceans. And if we could look at this in multiple ways, but clearly this is idea that if Scotland is like the oceans and it's like a raging ocean, it's unstable, it's violent, it causes suffering, it causes death through drowning. I think there's also this, I like to kind of include classical allusions possibly where I can. I think it's maybe an allusion to Poseidon and Neptune, who came up earlier in the video series, the god of the oceans, and the idea that Macbeth is the god of the oceans that is causing this violence. So he's the Poseidon in a sense in this metaphor. That might be a bit of a stretch, but I'll leave that one out there anyway. Then Ross has to leave. He leaves because he's in a sense, he's acting as if he was caught here, he'd be accused of treason, so he has to leave. Lady Macduff very kind of emphatically announces that her son has a father, and yet he's fatherless, and it's a kind of paradox you'd expect to hear from the witches. It's a sort of a riddle, isn't it? He's got a father, and yet he's fatherless, but I think it's slightly more obvious in terms of the meaning. What she means by that is that she's emphasising the point of the neglect. He's been abandoned by his father, this young boy. And again, Ross says, "I'm so much a fool. Should I stay longer? I need to leave because if I'm caught in this place, I would be accused of treason." He exits. So we come to the end of this first part of the scene, and I've got my checkpoint mark here. So I'd like you to take about 10 minutes to go over the scene so far, summarise your understanding of the scene so far. And obviously that you need to pause the video. So I'll see you again in 10 minutes or so. Welcome back. We now have a shift in the scene. So we left off with Ross departing. He says he can't stay any longer because if he's caught or if someone sees him, he'll be accused of treason himself and possibly the victim of Macbeth's tyranny. What's interesting in the next scene is there's a shift. And it's a clever decision by Shakespeare because he shifts. The murder does not happen straight away. There's a very tender scene, and there's an image on the screen that exemplifies this. There's a tender scene in which Lady Macduff essentially has a conversation, a kind of conversation with her son, who's presumably her only child, and they talk about the father's desertion, and the boy is really witty and quite outspoken in a similar way to how Lady Macduff was presented in the last part of the scene. She's quite outspoken herself. Remember, she openly accuses her husband of cowardice and desertion, which is quite bold for a woman in a patriarchal society. But in this scene, she's presented as being a very protective mother, as being quite witty alongside her son, and most importantly, as being a round and human character. The murder that's about. Remember, as an audience, there's a sense of dramatic irony because we know that Macbeth has plotted to surprise the castle, in his own words. That's how he puts it. He's going to storm the castle and have them all murdered, and the murder is more shocking and more profound and creates more pathos because Shakespeare gives us this very short scene in which we see a mother and child communicating, and we see them in this very ordinary domestic setting and in a state of fear. And the fact that he humanizes them, the fact that he creates them as round characters essentially, makes their death all the more appalling and all the more tragic when it occurs. This is an incredibly climactic and tragic scene. It's intended to pull at our heartstrings and to further incriminate Macbeth as a character. So the other thing I'll say about Lady Macbeth and Lady Macduff quickly is that lots of critics often point out she's a kind of foil to Lady Macbeth. That they share similar qualities in the sense that they're both outspoken women, in the sense that they're both wives to powerful husbands. But there's the key difference. That's why the reason they're foils is there's this key difference. Lady Macduff is clearly loyal. She clearly is a good and virtuous person and a protective mother, whereas on the other hand, Lady Macbeth is the total opposite of that. So lots of critics have read her as being a foil to Lady Macbeth. So this scene is very tender, it's very heartwarming. Like I said, the son is presented as being very witty, and it makes their death all the more appalling and all the more tragic when it actually happens, which is moments later. So let's read through the scene. I'm not going to go into too much detail in the close reading afterwards, but I think it's important to read it through. I'll start with Lady Macduff. Sirrah, your father's dead. And what will you do now? How will you live? As birds do, mother. What, with worms and flies? With what I get, I mean, and so do they. Poor bird, thou wouldst never fear the net, nor lime, the pitfall, nor the gin. Why should I, mother? Poor birds they are not set for. My father is not dead, for all your saying. Yes, he is dead. How wilt thou do for a father? Nay, how will you do for a husband? Why, I can buy me 20 at any market. Then you'll buy 'em to sell 'em again. Thou speaks with all thy wit, and yet in faith with wit enough for thee. Was my father a traitor, mother? Ay, that he was. What is a traitor? Why, one that swears and lies. And be all traitors that do so? Every one that does so is a traitor, and must be hanged. And must they all be hanged that swear and lie? Every one. Who must hang them? Why, the honest men. Then the liars and swearers are fools, for there are liars and swearers enough to beat the honest men and hang them up. Now God help thee, poor monkey, but how wilt thou do for a father? If he were dead, you'd weep for him. If he would not, it were a good sign that I should quickly have a new father. Poor prattler, how thou talkst. Okay, I'm going to go very quickly over some of the significant moments. I think this is a very heartwarming scene. It's very tender. It gives you a glimpse into the Macduff household and the joy and the warmth in that household, in contrast to Macbeth's household. Okay, so like I said earlier, I think what's most important is how endearing and tender this scene is, and how it would pull at the audience's heartstrings, how it would create that pathos and the sense of dread that we're all experiencing and watching this, knowing that they will soon be brutally murdered. I think there isn't a whole lot that I would talk about. I think the idea that of this bird image coming up again and again. The son says, "I'll live like a bird now, I'll fend for myself." And this reference to the bird, obviously coming straight off the back of the comparison of Macduff, the husband, to the wren who's not defended his nest. There's also this cheekiness and the mischievous nature of the boy would again cause a bit of lightheartedness in the play. It injects some kind of surprising comedy. I think it's quite funny that he's able to talk back to his mother in this kind of impetuous way. When she asks what he will do for a father, he actually responds quite quick-wittedly, "What will you do for a husband?" When she says, I'll buy one. I could buy 20 husbands at a market. He says that you'll buy them to sell them because he's quite shrewd. I think he's quite clever. When he asks, why should traitors be hanged and who by? She says, by honest men, and he again humorously responds, then the liars and swearers are fools because there's more of them than there are of the honest men, so they should hang them, which is again showing his wit and humour. And the last thing I think is quite interesting is this idea of I know that he's not dead, because if he were, you'd weep for him, or maybe it's a good sign I'll have a new father. And again, he's cheekily suggesting that his mother might remarry quite quickly, and it's just tender, it's sweet, it's a nice domestic scene between a mother and a son. Now let's move on. We're not. I know there's checkpoint marks there, but we're actually going to move straight on to the messenger and to the climactic moment. And I'll spell climactic here, because this is what we've been dreading as an audience. We know, because of what Macbeth said earlier, that he's going to surprise this castle. He's going to have these human characters brutally killed. It's a very tragic scene. So the messenger arrives, and he very quickly essentially tells them that murderers are coming. Be not found here, he says. And then he himself has to leave again, because he sorry about that, my knocking at my clumsiness. He then says, I have to leave because I'm in danger as well. So he very quickly arrives and very quickly exits. We then have again this very poetic use of the reference to flying, and this idea of bird imagery again. Whither should I fly? Where should I fly to? And again, this idea that, ironically, Lady Macduff is becoming that wren that we saw earlier. She's becoming the wren that has to defend her nest against the owl, and the owl metaphorically here are the murderers that are arriving. And of course, she is a helpless, fragile, vulnerable character. She's not going to be able to fight them off, is she? She says, what? I've done no harm. I've done nothing wrong. I remember now that I'm in danger. She says, would I put up a woman in defence to say that I've done no harm? And then the murderers arrive. But it's important that she says I've done no harm, that I'm mortal, because again it emphasises her innocence. And again, the fact that Macbeth is so willingly and so swiftly murdering innocence is hugely important, because it adds to this idea of him being a tyrant. The murderers then enter, and I'll read the scene out before going over it in a bit more detail. And we're not sure if they're the same murderers from earlier on, by the way, but from the Banquo and Fleance murder. Enter murderers. Where is your husband? I hope in no place so unsanctified where such as thou may find him. First murderer, he's a traitor. Thou liest, thou shag-eared villain. What, you egg? Stabbing him. Young fry of treachery. He has killed me, mother. Run away, I pray you. Son dies. Exit Lady Macduff, crying murderer. Exeunt the murderers following her. So it's a very powerful, tragic scene. I think that last image is in the stage directions has this haunting effect, because we know what's going to happen. We know she is helpless, that she will be killed, but there's not the certainty. Shakespeare doesn't give us the certainty of knowing that she's been killed until later on. So it kind of haunts the audience, and it creates a great deal of pathos. At the beginning, I think it's also interesting just to go back to this idea of gender and how that's presented throughout the play. I think Lady Macduff is presented as being herself incredibly brave, and you might again compare her to Macduff in a sense, who's fled. Lady Macduff, when asked where her husband is, speaks back to the murderers. She's brave enough to insult them. She says, I hope he's not in a place as filthy and unsanctified, which means kind of unholy, where such as you may find him. So she insults the murderers. She speaks back to them, which I think is brave. And again, we talked about gender in this patriarchal society. I think she's an example of a brave, outspoken woman who's divergent in a sense. She goes against expectations. The son, similarly, also when his father's called a traitor, the son also speaks back to the murderers and is killed as a result. He's stabbed, and I think it's significant that the son of Lady Macduff is killed on stage, because again, it's that. It exemplifies and embodies this idea of the innocent being killed. What is more innocent than a young boy who has done nothing wrong, who's merely the son of Macduff being brutally killed? I think it's particularly, again, a moment of pathos, a moment of a shocking moment for the audience to see the brutality of Macbeth in action. And they call him the young fry of treachery, because this idea that he's an egg that will hatch and one day be a traitor as well. It's kind of, again, another reference to bird imagery that's run throughout the scene. And then the son poignantly declares that he's killed me, mother, run away, I pray you. So he thinks about his mother's safety, and then we have that haunting image, as we've said. And that's the end of the scene, and we're about to move on to Act 4, Scene 3. But of course, I would like to take a checkpoint here and to go over your notes, summarise this scene and complete the quiz that I've set you on Show My Homework. This will take you, quite a bit of time here. So make sure you read over your notes. Make sure you read through the scene itself again, and I'll see you next time for the first part of Act 4, Scene 3.